Once you have your base layer, the next step is to modify the information that's on that base layer with all the other texture maps. So if we go here to our skull textures, let's start with this concrete. Let's start with this slightly porous pattern, and this is going to correlate with the areas on the skull that are right around the cheekbone. If I zoom in right here, we're trying to get this sort of detail. Okay, so let's drag that in. We'll say texture and then apply that to the project file itself. Once we have that, let's duplicate our base layer by saying Control D. And with that, I'm going to start off by multiplying against the color as well as the height. So I'll drag the same texture map into both of those channels. On the height, let's go ahead and just set this to a very low value. Let's say maybe a value of 2. And maybe even 2 is too much. Well, let's say 0.2. There we go. I think that might work. Yeah, okay, so about 0.2. Let's try that and see if that works pretty well. On the base color, I want to use this concrete and multiply against the underlying pixel values. So if I go to the blend mode here and set that to multiply, we've darkened everything and applied that concrete over the whole skull. Now this might be nice. You might like to have this as part of the base layer, but the idea is that we want to be a little bit more specific about where this is going. So what we can do instead is right-click this and go to levels, so add levels. And on the base color, if we set most of these pixels to white, then we're not going to darken the overall skull. But we are going to keep these pop marks in there. And so we can clip some of those values, bring that to 1 so it's not decreasing the overall value that we had before. And then we can adjust things like this so that we get some of that grit back in there. Okay, so that's what's going on with this channel. Once you get that fill layer the way that you want it to be, then you right-click and you say Add Black Mask. So we get rid of everything that just happened. Once we do that, let's take a look at our reference. And if we examine this, we can find areas that feature that sort of texture. Right along here in the cheekbones, that'll be good. I think generally speaking around the eyes, that would make sense. Around the mouth, and a little bit lightly here at the side of the head. We also have another angle on this. So towards the bottom, we also see that sort of thing happening. And so I'm going to focus most of this towards those areas. Control right mouse will change the brush size. And if we go to brushes, we have a few different options. Let's pick something besides the defaults. I'm going to go with, let's say, the dirt spots. And now, as I paint this in, as you can see, it begins revealing that layer. And the nice thing about painting like this is that we can very easily control how it's blending with everything else. So I can say exactly where I want this kind of detail. I just paint that in, and that's all pretty good. Now, one way you could do this is you could take a very hard brush like this. So you could say that basic hard brush, go like that, just kind of get your main areas that you want really quickly. And then once you have a general area defined, you could go to a softer brush, like let's say this cement, and basically erase what you just did towards the edges. So if I press X, that'll turn this mask color to black. And now I can take away what I just did. And so you can use a combination of kind of the hard strokes that you then kind of blend in like this. Or honestly, I just like using a brush that, like the dirt, just kind of gradually applies this over time. But you want to avoid any of those hard edges. It's always a good thing. And that is basically what you want to do. So I'm going to pause this video. I'm going to take a round of this over the whole skull, and then we'll talk about what to do next. So there we go. Now we have a bit more detail happening with the color channel and the height channel. We didn't include roughness on that, but I think it's okay for the time being. We still have enough breakup happening on the roughness where I don't think it's going to be a huge issue at the moment. However, now that you have this, the idea is to go through all those textures that you gathered and try them out. If we look at the reference, if we go back and forth between looking at the reference and looking at the textures that we've gathered, then that allows you to add layer by layer in a way that makes sense, in a way that looks natural because you're trying to generalize, you're trying to mimic the general shapes and colors and behaviors that are happening here in the reference. So one thing I'll experiment with real quick is let's go to Photoshop. We have this concrete. I want to multiply and create some dark splotchy areas. So if we look at the skull here, notice areas like this, where we just kind of have that darker splotchy color. It's not necessarily going into the skull. It's not necessarily a height situation, but it is a change in the color. So let's try using this map. I know I'm going to multiply these values ahead of time and use a brush to apply that. So I have whites at the very top, and I go down to a more, skull-like color. Once we multiply, these colors are going to saturate and darken at the same time. So let's save this out. We'll just say concrete 2. Again, this is kind of like our scratch folder in a way. And if this ever asks you to save layers, don't do that. Just say discard layers and save a copy. So right there. Let's now drag this in, and we'll call this a texture to the project. Make another fill. And before you move on to the next fill, name your stuff as you go. So we'll call this our general pop marks. There we go. Now let's bring over that concrete to the base color. We're only affecting color. We're going to apply this via triplanar projection. So triplanar, the scale, let's set that to about 3. And then on the base color, let's multiply. So there we go. That's exactly what I'm after. Okay, let's now create a black mask. And if you have dual monitors, that's ideal. You want to look at your reference and then paint out an area and go back and forth. Reference, project, reference, project. You want to do that with your eye as much as you can. So let's just look at this. There's areas on the side of the skull. There's areas here. There's areas perhaps down here as well. So I know, even though it's not the exact skull, I know those would be appropriate areas to paint this. So let's make a little splotch right there. Let's now go under the skull. A little discoloration right there. And as you can imagine, by layering things like this over time, what's going to happen is that layer by layer, it's just going to get better and better. As long as you're making decisions that have some sort of sense to them, that aren't just completely random, then usually it's going to improve the overall texturing. And also, you never want one layer to be too intense. You always want to be, for the most part, you always want to be fairly subtle about this, because by not going too crazy with it, you're leaving room for other layers to have an impact. So it definitely is a balancing act. Okay, we'll call this our darker coloration right there. Now if I click on the main layer right here, not the mask, but the main layer information, and I right click and go to add levels, now we can just take some of these values and darken them up if we want to. So I'm going to go too far with it, and then I'll slowly back up until this is good, and I'll go just a tad bit darker. So right around there. I think that's about the right amount to push this. Maybe even just go a little bit brighter. So we can go maybe right about there. Perfect. In the next video, let's talk about form.